Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College.
Lewis wrote about his magnum opus, his English literature in the 16th century, excluding drama, from the time he agreed to write it till it came out, 18 years.
Wow.
He read every book written in English in the 16th century to produce that book. In that particular book, Lewis says in this one letter that all the other things he wrote during that time were the twiddly bits.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
So that means Mere Christianity, the Narnian Chronicles, Screwtape Letters, all these, the science fiction books and so on, were all the twiddly books. So Lewis was steeped in this stuff. We should not be surprised then that it seeps out and everything else is right.
Right.
Welcome to the Wade Center podcast. This morning, Dr. Jerry Root, who is professor of evangelism at Wheaton College, has joined us in our basement along with our producer, Aaron Hill. Thank you so much, Jerry, for being here with us. We are interested in the book you have recently produced called The Neglected C.S. Lewis. And I wonder if we could start by having you tell us what led you to write it, and also if you could talk about your collaborator on the book.
Yeah, well, one of my concerns, there's so much stuff coming out about C.S. Lewis constantly, and it almost always says the same thing over and over and over again.
Yes.
And I know that there's so much more to explore in Lewis, and his breadth, his depth, it's remarkable. So we wanted to look at something that people have not explored. His best books, hands down, I think, are his literary critical works.
Yes.
And most people don't read them. Either they don't know they exist or they're intimidated by them, and they need not be intimidated. He writes so that they're very accessible.
Mm-hmm. Although there are people who think mere Christianity is too difficult to understand. So if they think mere Christianity is difficult, they may struggle with his literary criticism.
But he wrote, Mere Christianity, he wrote at the level of about a 14 to 16-year-old. And so consequently, what we've seen really is not a criticism of his books being too complex, but the dumbing down of the Western culture.
You're exactly right.
It's tragic. So what ended up happening is Mark and I had already done a book together, Mark Neal, on C.S. Lewis's surprising imagination.
And how do you know him?
We've known each other as friends since he was a student at Wheaton years ago, and then we're in a Thursday night discussion group, and he's been the longest attending member.
I see.
And he's also written a few journal articles, but hadn't had a book come out yet. So I said, Mark, you and I need to write this book on these 31 different ways Lewis uses the imagination. And it worked well, and he's a very good writer. He's a much better writer than I am. And then after that book was over, we said, well, let's do another project together. So the Wade Center was kind enough to allow us to give these lectures on the neglected C.S. Lewis. And we looked at 8 of these literary critical works. And then we were approached by some folks at Paraclete, said we would be interested in publishing that as a book. So then we had to do a little bit more rigorous work to refine, the lectures. And it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of work, but it was a lot of fun. And sometimes, like a farmer, you do hard work and you get the harvest.
Yeah.
Right. I mentioned in the foreword, did I mention I wrote the foreword for this book?
You know what? Not only does that need to be mentioned, but also I'm very grateful. And some people have thought the foreword's probably the best part of the book.
Well, I enjoyed writing the foreword because I enjoyed the book. A lot of these books by Lewis, he is very detailed in his scholarship. And so you see the trees, but sometimes it helps to have someone guide them as to what is the forest. Something like the Allegory of Love. I thought you all did a wonderful job of talking about this theme of the beatification of the female and courtly love, but then slowly seeing that evolve toward a celebration of Christian marriage. Once you point that out, you can really see that thread in the book, but readers may have missed that because of all the wealth of detail in the book itself. But what I was starting to say about the foreword, when I was in graduate school at UCLA, my professor said, read Discarded Image, read Allegory of Love, read this volume on the 16th century, Preface to Paradise Lost. And none of them were Christians, and none of them cared about his Christian writings or his children's literature or his apologetics. And I realized what a distinguished scholar he must be, that all of these professors felt they needed to reckon with the great C.S. Lewis without caring about the Christian side. Now, when you come out of academia, the situation is just the reversed. People know the Ransom Trilogy and Narnia and the Christian apologetics. But as you say, they're intimidated by the scholarly books. Now, when you originally said the neglected C.S. Lewis, I don't think of Lewis being neglected. So I thought there was another guy named like Chauncey Seymour Lewis who wrote books on bottle caps, and just nobody respects him. Everybody knows Clive Staples. But then I realized you're talking about the books which general readers don't really dive into without the help of someone like you.
It's interesting you say this about studying literature at UCLA and so on. When Claudia and I, my wife, went on our first date, I asked her if she had heard of C.S. Lewis, and she said no. So the next week, I sent her a copy of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. She said once she got it, she looked at the name, and then she went to her shelf, and she says, I've been reading this guy for a long time, because she had read, as an English major, Preface to Paradise Lost, Allegory of Love, and so on. And so this was really interesting to me that she had this. Now, the other thing I find fascinating, I was a physical education major. I went to college and didn't read the catalog. I just thought that would be the easiest major that would keep me eligible for sports. I didn't realize we had a recreation major too that had all of the games but none of the sciences. That would have been easier, but nevertheless. But I became a Christian. My mind woke up. I read through the Bible that year. I got into C.S. Lewis, started reading Lewis. And what I'm trying to say is a person that was not trained in these areas can find Lewis opens more than wardrobe doors. He takes you to these books. When you mentioned the Allegory of Love, when I first read that, and I've read it many times, when I first read it, I was so fascinated by what he said about the Romance of the Rose. I went and read the Romance of the Rose. I go, oh my heavens, this is breathtaking. I read what he wrote about Chaucer. Everybody knows the most bawdy sections of Canterbury Tales, because those are the ones you read in school. You don't read the spiritually deep ones and so on. But I read Troilus and Cressida. And I remember when I first finished that, I had been spending a couple weeks in this book, and I was on an airplane, and I burst into tears at the end of it. I'm a high T on the Myers-Briggs. I live in my head. I'm not supposed to cry. I burst into tears, and I'm scrunching down in my seat, not because I'm embarrassed of the tears if somebody asked, but I wouldn't be able to have done justice to that world I had been living in if somebody just asked me off the top of my head. I think it's one of the greatest stories I've ever read in my life. And Lewis took me to those places. Nobody should be intimidated by what he writes in these books. Instead, you should look at the world that he's opening up for you.
I just encountered a great statement from C.S. Lewis about the Romance of the Rose because, and this goes along with what we're talking about, famous literary scholars in the 1940s were citing C.S. Lewis, and every English major has heard about Wimsatt and Beardsley talking about the intentional fallacy and the affective fallacy. And we can talk a little bit more about that because it relates to the personal heresy. But they actually quote the line from C.S. Lewis saying, "The Romance of the Rose could not, without loss, be rewritten as the Romance of the Onion." And that is so quintessentially Lewis. Here it's a part of his literary criticism, but he is illustrating with such a down-home, witty, slyly humorous illustration that these particular perceptions are shared by us culturally, and we learn about the values of a culture by reading these texts.
Well, that comment that you just read, Crystal, it actually comes from the personal heresy. And in the context of that statement, he says, if you don't get this, you've got to go back to your garden. And you've got to study onions, and you've got to study roses, and you've got to see why there's a reality that supports that descriptive statement. And Lewis is an objectivist, and you always have to help people understand. We don't mean by that an Enlightenment rationalist. His objectivism is like a magic before the dawn of time. It goes back to the ancient Greeks and through the scholastics and so on. And so consequently, Lewis, in all of his literary criticism, is trying to get to the text. There's something there that's real. And our tendencies are to project on the text what we bring to the text rather than draw from the text so that we might be enlarged as human beings rather than merely projecting ourselves. So anyway, that line is a great line. I love it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he also says in the Personal Heresy, we come to an author to read what the author has written. We don't try to understand the author. We use the author as spectacles. We don't try to make a spectacle of the author.
Mm-hmm.
And it usually ends up that the author that we're making a spectacle of is an author of our own making.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is similar to what happens in theological trends. There are these literary trends. And the best way to think about it is if you have in the circle at the middle of a cross the word the work, the literary work, each of the edges of the cross can refer to different aspects of the work. And so one of them is the author, one is the reader, one is the world that the text reveals, and another is the words of the text. And what happens in literary criticism is these trends develop where only one of those four components gets emphasized. And of course, that's what the Personal Heresy is responding to, where everybody was talking about, it's about what's going on in the mind of the author. Mm-hmm. And so it's all about the expressivism of the author, and you try to get to the author's mind to the point that people are ignoring the other three components. It reminds me of in the early church, how even though we are told that Jesus is both fully human and fully divine, is Christians so often just fall into one or the other, and they overemphasize his divinity and just can't handle the fact that Jesus had to eliminate waste. We talked about that on another podcast. Or people who just reduce Jesus to a godly human being rather than Jesus was fully God. And so approaching a literary text is creating a balance, and Lewis was addressing the imbalance of his time.
I think this idea of balance is really important. Go back to the Romance of the Rose again. You see, deeply influencing that book was Boethius's A Consolation of Philosophy. So one of the neglected books we talk about is The Discarded Image. And Lewis, these were lectures he gave at Oxford for 29 years, his prolegomena lectures, helping students understand that medieval worldview so they're not projecting 21st century values into a medieval book. He says, hands down, after the Bible, the most influential book on medieval literature was Boethius's A Consolation of Philosophy. When I read that, Lewis even said a person wasn't considered educated up to 200 years ago if they didn't know that book. I'd never heard of it when I read The Discarded Image first time back in college. So I go get The Discarded Image, Boethius, A Consolation of Philosophy, took my breath away. I'd say it's one of the 10 best books I've ever read. Lewis gives a 16-page discussion to this book. So many people today are confused about foreknowledge and free will. If God foreknows what we're going to do before we do it, then do we really have free will when we get to that moment? Boethius solves that problem so simply that we say, why did I ever have a problem with it? And Lewis gives a 2-page discussion just to that alone in this book. But anyway, you go back and read The Romance of the Rose, Boethius is dripping on every page. You go back and read Milton's Paradise Lost, Boethius is coming through. You read Chaucer, Boethius is coming through. Pander, one of the characters in Chaucer's Troilus and Cressida, basically retells the entire argument of Boethius. So you end up not only getting Lewis and getting Lewis on a book, but you get Lewis on a book that takes you to another book. The whole thing is like roots going down in the ground or branches branching out from a tree. I think it can help us from overstating things. That's what we tend to do. You know, the atheist, for example, says there is no God. And I go, there's 19 million volumes under the roof of the Widener Library at Harvard. And you're telling me there's nothing in any of those books that would count against what you're saying right now? Come on, give me an honest agnostic any day than this overstated person. It keeps us from these overstatements. It helps us realize there's a complexity. And if we see it like Lewis does with faith integration, it's a complexity then that reinforces our entire milieu of faith. We begin to see the whole background and we see how it influences, and it's integrated and it's glorious. And Lewis does that for us as a Christian academic as well.
Chesterton, your example of there is no God, Chesterton said, well, that's a positive assertion that needs to be proven. That's like saying there are no insects on other planets. You have to prove that as much as you would have to prove that, there are.
And Lewis even says it's for me to say there is no spider in this room, I'd have to check every nook and cranny.
Right.
Although
right.
since this is your house, I'm sure there is no spider in it.
We're in the basement.
We
again.
are in the basement, though.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
But to say there is a spider, you can just see one scurrying across the floor. Now, obviously, proofs for God's existence or whatnot are more complex than that, but nevertheless, it shows the difficulty of this overstated, there is no God. Or it helps us too, I think, back to Lewis's literary criticism, the fact that he can look at complex number of ideas with not a faith that is dissembled by this, but a faith that is enlarged by this, because he begins to see over and over again, a faith perspective of life gives me more opportunity to appreciate all that I see. The materialist has to begin with, from the outset, there is no supernatural. So the possibility of supernatural doesn't even come to him. And consequently, as a result of that, he just discounts it. The faith-based person could be more open-minded than the materialist every time.
Right.
Of course, because the materialist has limited the possibilities of the world to just empirically verifiable material realities, whereas the person who believes in the supernatural has expanded beyond that. So it's a much more open, broader worldview. It's kind of ironic that people of faith have been called narrow-minded. One of the things that your discussion reminds me of in terms of the complexity of Lewis is the knowledge that a person he was reacting to was I.A. Richards, who kind of revolutionized literary criticism. And here is what Richards, who was kind of buying into the atheist modernist assumptions that had been embellished since the Enlightenment, Richards wrote in Science and Poetry, quote, "Countless pseudo-statements about God, about the universe, about human nature, about the soul, its rank and destiny, have suddenly become, for sincere, honest, and informed minds, impossible. For centuries they have been believed. Now they are gone irrecoverably. However, if we can contrive to believe poetry, then the world seems, while we do so, to be transfigured." So what Richards was doing was turning poetry itself, literature itself, into an alternate religion. We can't believe in this God stuff. We can't believe in human nature, but poetry will save our souls. And that was a pure subjectivism, is that poetry ministers to us because we can't count on God. We can't count on the church. And you can see why Lewis would respond adversely to that. But then I go through all of Lewis's letters this morning, seeking every time that he mentions I.A. Richards, even though I knew he didn't like I.A. Richards. And he would defend certain things Richards said.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is what impresses me about Lewis, is he didn't retreat into this either or mindset where because you agree with a lot of something that someone says, you just discount that entire person. He was willing to even learn from I.A. Richards, and he defended some things I.A. Richards said. I mean, that is part of his brilliance.
Well,
and I wish we had more of that today, frankly.
This gets back, though, to what you had said earlier about the Christian understanding of Jesus as both God and man. If you consider these people who are materialists, and they will say, I actually had a student, she was a Brown University student, very bright Ivy Leaguer. She visited a friend of hers and came to class, and we were talking afterwards. And I said, well, so it was a Lewis class, actually. And I said, so what'd you think about the spiritual things we talked about today? And she says, well, frankly, as a biochemist, she was only a sophomore, so I think she probably overplayed it. But as a biochemist, I live by the principle, if I can't perceive it empirically, I just won't believe it.
Mm.
And I said, really, the principle you live by is if you can't perceive it empirically, you won't believe it. She says, yes. I said, would you please set forth that principle empirically for me?
Right.
And she all of a sudden saw the contradiction and freaked out.
Mm-hmm.
And she says, oh, my word, everybody at Brown University believes this. I said, no, there's Christians at Brown University too. You'd be surprised. They kind of get everywhere. Plus, to be honest, not all materialists would assert what you just said to the degree you asserted it.
Right.
So consequently, it's one of these things where, again, if it's only matter, I can only see through a narrow lens. If there's a supernatural, I can see the material and the supernatural,
Right.
and I can begin to consider it. And as you said earlier, that Christians can be more open-minded than the materialist.
Well, once again, we're talking about Lewis, not Chesterton, but Chesterton said, if you have a report of a miracle, a materialist can't look at it objectively because they've already presupposed
Decided in
a priori
advance.
there cannot be miracles. Where a Christian can look at that particular incident and they're open to the possibility it was a miracle, but they can look objectively whether or not that might count as a supernatural event.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Let's get back to the neglected C.S. Lewis.
Mm-hmm.
I'm feeling the neglected Jerry Root here. One thing I want you to talk more about, and one of your points you made was in reading these books, the neglected books, as you call them, you get more insight into the popular books. And I wanted to talk about a few examples. You mentioned the Romance of the Rose. When you're reading along, a lot of people, the first time they ever heard of Romance of the Rose, they're reading That Hideous Strength. And when Jane first sees the garden at St. Anne's, where Ransom and his community are, she says it reminded her of the walled garden of the Romance of the Rose.
Mm-hmm.
And I love how Lewis plays both sides of the street, because if you wonder what he means by the Romance of the Rose, go read the Allegory of Love, and you'll know why he included that illusion in That Hideous Strength. And I think this could have almost been a whole chapter in your book, which would have been things in the popular books, the well-known books, that are illuminated by reading the neglected books. Pelagianism, he was writing Preface to Paradise Lost, and that whole story is what I wish Milton had done a little differently in Paradise Lost. Let's not make Satan quite so impressive. He had several criticisms of Paradise Lost, and he fixed them all in Pelagianism. He said, when I tell the story, I'm not going to make those same mistakes.
I'm going to make the lady green.
Exactly.
Can you guys explain for the non-initiated some of these stories that you keep mentioning for non-English majors out there? Can you explain what the Romance of the Rose is? Some of the story you keep mentioning a number of these things, and it would be helpful for maybe people who haven't read them. Who wrote them? Where do they come from? What are they talking about? All I know at this point is that Romance of the Rose involves not onions and a walled garden.
The Romance of the Rose actually had two authors.
Right.
Jean Mune wrote the second half, and the first half was it's a senior moment. I'll tell you in just a second. But anyway, this man in quest of the perfect beloved. And I think that while he may start out relatively innocent, I think the goal is to deflower this woman. And so he's questing to break into this garden where she is in all of her purity. But in the second half, Jean Mune, who Lewis says tried to incorporate everything in medieval thinking. He says the quality of a medieval book was that they believed one in authority, and the authorities were in books. But books often contradicted. So they would try and get all of that in and reconciled in some sort of new book they were writing. They also would embellish what came before. So Guillaume Delory wrote the first half of that book, Guillaume Delory. So Jean Mune just goes crazy, and it's long, it's cumbersome, it's interesting in its way, but it has less of the narrative glory that the Guillaume Delory part of this book has. But it was a big influential book on medieval literature. And then even like you said about Lewis, and getting back to your comment about how much of Lewis's story, his own novels and so on, are influenced by this medieval literature. It's significant. And there was a blurb that Michael Ward, who wrote Planet Narnia and so on, contributed to endorsement of this book. And he said that in his letters, Lewis wrote about his magnum opus, his English literature in the 16th century, excluding drama. From the time he agreed to write it till it came out, 18 years.
Wow.
He read every book written in English in the 16th century to produce that book. He read every book translated in English in the original language it was written, Italian, French, Latin, and in translation so that the comparison would be fair-minded. in that particular book, Lewis says in this one letter, as Michael Ward points out, that all the other things he wrote during that time were the twiddly bits.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
So that means Mere Christianity, the Narnian Chronicles, Screw Tape Letters, all these, the science fiction books and so on, were all the twiddly books. So Lewis was steeped in this stuff. We should not be surprised then that it seeps out in everything else he's writing.
Right.
And you like to talk about a particular character in the silver chair that Lewis mentions, a concept he mentions in Oh Hell, and I'll give you the glory of talking about it.
In his magisterial summary of the 16th century excluding drama, he mentions a minor poet named John Studley who just wasn't that talented. And when Studley started to describe the fiery river Styx, which separates the earth from hell, this character, he calls it a puddle glum. And Lewis thought that was hilarious to have such an odd description of the river Styx. And so when we get to the Marshwiggle in the silver chair, why not name him Puddle Glum? It's a perfect name for that character.
You know, you go back to the English literature in the 16th century, excluding drama. So, he talks about, of course, Barnaby Googe, who wrote Out of Sight, Out of Mind. When I was in college, Out of Sight. Everybody called everything Out of Sight.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
But he talked about a guy named Michael Drayton, who wrote Idea. I had never read Drayton, but just from what Lewis said about him, I went and read all of Michael Drayton's poetry, and it was breathtaking. I think some of his sonnets are better than Shakespeare's sonnets and better even than Philip Sidney and Edmund Spencer's sonnets. They're just fabulous stuff.
Yeah,
Drayton is included in most poetry anthologies. I taught Michael Drayton just
But
to
he's not as
intro
well known.
students.
But that was the world you came from. Remember,
Yeah,
I'm the PE
yeah.
major. If it doesn't have Wilson or Rawlings on it, I probably don't understand it.
I also like his book Jurassic Park. It's really good.
That would be Crichton.
Oh, Crichton.
Oh, good point.
Oh, gosh. Okay.
You know,
all right.
you mentioned explaining things. He called it Oh Hell because it was the Oxford History of English Literature. He got the contract in the 30s, and it didn't come out until the mid 50s. So it was 18 years in the making.
Yeah.
Wow.
He said in one letter, it was like when you marry the rich old aristocrat and you're so excited, but then it takes 18 years for him to die, and you actually have to live with it for 18 years.
Well, Helen Gardner said that she could see him in Duke Humphreys, which is a part of the Bodleian Library. It's medieval part of the Bodleian Library. Some of the books are still chained to the shelves and stuff. And she said to watch him as he was working on that book was an embodiment of concentration. And it was remarkable.
I wanted to read a passage from another thing you mentioned in your book is you'll be reading along, getting a lot of good literary history, a lot of criticism, insight, and suddenly there'll be this sterling passage, which is so C.S. Lewis. And the Oh Hell volume, which is how many pages? It's 800 pages or something?
Yeah, it's close to 700 pages.
Well, you're reading along about cultural history in England and how the Protestant Reformation had a huge influence on literature. And he says a lot of people, when they hear the word Protestant, they think of protest, that it's all negative. You're not doing this right. This is not the proper church hierarchy. This is not the proper theology. And he just says, no, it was a much more positive experience than that. To become a Protestant, you felt like something was missing in traditional theology. So out of the blue, I just lost my text here. It says, this is Lewis talking about being an early Protestant. All the initiative has been on God's side. All has been free, unbounded grace. And all will continue to be free, unbounded grace. His own puny and ridiculous efforts would be as helpless to retain the joy as they would have been to achieve it in the first place, he the Protestant. Fortunately, they need not. Bliss is not for sale, cannot be earned. Works have no merit, though of course faith inevitably, even unconsciously, flows out into works of love at once. He's not saved because he does works of love. He does works of love because he is saved. It is faith alone that has saved him. Faith bestowed by sheer gift. From this buoyant humility, this farewell to the self, with all its good resolutions, anxiety, scruples, and motive scratchings, all the Protestant doctrines originally sprang. And what a brilliant paragraph in the middle of a 700-page book of cultural
This
history.
is interesting, though, too, David, because the 16th century, of course, is the century of the Reformation. and great religious controversy, and he has a whole section in that book on religious controversy. Lewis is the only person I know that read thoroughly both sides of the Reformation. And his judgments are more nuanced. Again, not the overstatement,
Right.
like the atheists, as we mentioned earlier. And so he says the Protestants thought the Catholics were Pelagian. The Catholics thought the Protestants were antinomian. He said both were wrong. And so you could find the Pelagians among the Catholics, and you could find the antinomians among the Protestants, but you'd have to do bottom fishing. You'd have to look at the worst of the other side. And so oftentimes what we do, if we disagree with somebody, we find the worst example of that position. And it's easy to dismantle. It's like a straw man argument. But Lewis nuances things carefully because he's read thoroughly.
Right.
And the other thing, too, about Lewis, you could maybe call him a lay theologian. That would be possible. He was not a theologian, but he was more informed than most theologians I know. And why do I say he was not a theologian? One, he wasn't professionally trained as a theologian. But number two, he didn't do what theologians do. Usually theologians will look at a particular problem and try to look at it theologically. Lewis will look at a particular problem and he tries to deal with it from a sort of literary point of view. Maybe he benefits from this and benefits from that, and he puts the pieces together and with all the threads weaves a very interesting fabric of explaining something. But he had a lay theological mind, and it was an informed lay theological mind. Thomas Aquinas made this statement: an abuse does not nullify a proper use. If we judge any segment of society by its worst examples, none of us could stand. And Lewis doesn't do that. He doesn't judge anybody by its worst examples.
Like my example of I.A. Richards.
Exactly.
Even though he was reacting against it, he refused to vilify him.
He could nuance, and he could see the good in what he would write, as well as see the things that he could be critical of, because he kept his eye on the subject. He wasn't trying to project on that person.
That's interesting. You brought up Pelagianism, which a lot of people may not realize what it is. My understanding, I was reading about it because the great theologian Karl Barth accused Dorothy Sayers, and we always have to get Dorothy Sayers into our podcast. So here she is.
Ding, exactly.
Yeah. Barth accused Sayers of Pelagianism because of her theology of the Imago Dei, that creativity fulfills the Imago Dei, that when you're creative, you are exercising the image of God, because after all, Genesis 1 is about God not as judge, not as lawgiver, but as creator. And Genesis 1:27, we're created in the image of God. So Pelagianism was actually, as I started studying it, a result of an overreaction, or our understanding of it is an overreaction of Augustine, who so rebelled against it because Augustine was committed to this idea of original sin. And Pelagius, this contemporary of Augustine, wasn't sure whether babies were born in original sin, because the Bible doesn't clarify that. And the possibility that humans can choose the good even apart from grace. And so, but it isn't as extreme as what Augustine turns it into. And so it's that the way many times we get certain ideas is when enemies of those ideas overstate them, like your example of atheists.
Well, Pelagius, too, wasn't quite sure if he had ever sinned also. So that's a problem. But the other thing too is if Bart was reacting to Dorothy Sayers because she said being creative was what was implicit in being made in the image of a creator, Tolkien says the same thing. We're sub-creators. But that's not all. In other words, sometimes we see a thread in the fabric and we pull on that thread and we miss the other threads. Because even in the creation account, right at the beginning, it says, let us make man in our own image. Who is it? Who's the us? The first three words of the Old Testament, Breshith bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created. You have a plural noun for God, and you have a singular verb, bara, created. So you've got a plural and a singular. working together. You've got something anticipating the Trinity in the first three words of the Old Testament.
And that's why Sayers says creativity itself is Trinitarian.
Well, and that's exactly right, too. So now we've got Trinity and creativity. We've got more things.
Right.
So Bart rushed to judgment and judging her. But the other thing, too, the fact that God creates something other than himself, that God creates and participating with let us, who's the us. And then also when God creates, he then communicates about that creation. Communication is a community activity, right? It assumes there's relationship going on at some level. So these are fascinating things, but Lewis is big on that. And you go back to the preface to Paradise Lost, and he talks about the issues of the Trinity and so on too, also in there. Lewis is decidedly Trinitarian. The wonderful passages on the Trinity he has even in Mere Christianity and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But he also, in Preface to Paradise Lost, I was talking earlier about how the neglected works often illuminate the more popular works.
Yes.
There's a scene in Voyage of the Dawn Treader where Reepicheep wants to go off and seek Aslan's country. And that's perfectly fine for him to do that. He's a knight errant. He's a free agent. And Caspian is the king and wants to go with him. And Aslan has to appear to Caspian and say, you're the king. You can't renounce the throne and go off on this adventure. And I'm sure there's a passage in Preface to Paradise Lost where he says, there are sins of station. If you're the king, you shouldn't be a tyrant and abuse your power, but you also shouldn't be remiss and not assert your responsibilities, your duties. And I think when it's okay for Reepicheep to go venturing for Aslan's country, but it's not okay for Caspian, that would be an example of remissness, not accepting your responsibilities.
I think that's in the passage in that passage from the chapter on hierarchies.
Right.
You also see that in how Tor and Tinadril step into their station, the calling that God has given them. And then Ransom actually says, I wish I could just stay here. And then the Oyarsa, says, no, actually, you need to go back. And so there's this idea of like, they each have a task and a station, and they all fulfill it in the end and are obedient.
Right.
And the whole idea.
One body and many gifts.
And the whole metaphor that he gives throughout the book of the wave that's coming, that's not anticipated, and being disobedient and not choosing to go with whatever God is giving in that moment. That's a big part of Perelandra, but I think it's sort of woven throughout the whole story.
Well, you were talking about Lewis's balance. There's another line in the Ohel volume where he says, when Catholicism goes astray, it's like all other religions. There's priesthood, there's talismans, there's rituals, there's pageantry. Whereas when Protestantism goes astray, it's like no religion at all. It's just a bunch of ethical platitudes. And that's such an interesting observation, but it's fairly balanced. It shows that either orientation can easily lead you to an imbalance or almost heresy.
Well, it begins to tell you in what way that it might go astray, too. Because in the Reformation, they moved the pulpit from the side because the preached message was a part of the service. And they moved the pulpit to the middle because the preached message was the essence of the service. The other things were accoutrements. I've even been to churches before where they talk about the worship and the singing as preliminaries. It's not essential.
Yeah.
And so consequently, if you have a high liturgical church that may drift from Scripture, you still have this deeply rooted liturgy that is rooted in Scripture, and you still get the words coming through. But if you have a Protestant church that goes liberal and steps away from the Scripture, you get Time magazine. You don't get virtually anything of significance.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's truth there, but obviously we would rather have something that would be biblically centered and expressed in community in a way that would root the community's culture, their ways of approaching life, their ways of celebration, the things that you'd find in the liturgy. We would hope that all of it would be there.
Right.
Once again, as we discussed earlier, Lewis's both and thinking that mirrored the both and nature of Jesus Christ, whom he served.
Well, this comes through in the Neglected C.S. Lewis, because one of the books we deal with is the Arthurian Torso. And this was Lewis basically executing a debt he felt he had to his friend Charles Williams, who had been an Inkling, died at the very end of World War II suddenly. And Lewis does essays presented to Charles Williams. It was going to be a festschrift for Williams, but he died before they could give it to him as a festschrift, so they wrote it as a memorial volume and gave all the royalties to his wife. But Williams had written poetry on the Arthurian legend, and he had had deep discussions with Lewis about them, and Lewis talks about them. So recently, maybe 2 weeks ago now, a great evangelical theologian died, J.I. Packer.
Mm-hmm.
And J.I. Packer, I knew him fairly well in the 80s. He would come minister to this group I had maybe 4 or 5 times a year. And we had many discussions. He was a big fan of Lewis's, but more so of Charles Williams.
Mm-hmm.
And Packer thought that Williams was such a great original theological thinker, not original in that he's disassociated from the rich tradition, but original in his attempt to apply that rich tradition to present time. So anyway, Williams talks about this phrase. He uses it in Figure of Beatrice. He uses it in his Descent of the Dove, church history. He uses it also in his Arthurian lore, that we could say of anything, this also is thou, capital thou. Anything you see in a world God has made, we could say this also is thou. You're at risk of becoming an idolater, so you also have to balance it. Here's your balance, Crystal. You have to balance it by saying, neither is this thou. And so we talk about these two features of Christianity. You have the cataphatic coming down, kata, the Greek word for down. You have the cataphatic, God manifesting his presence in things. It's immanent, but then that's not all. That doesn't define God. God is also transcendent. So he's apophatic from, he's greater and bigger than. And this affects our ways of worship even. So the cataphatic approaches to worship is that we employ all of the sensibilities. Empirics is alive in this worship. You have the colors of the church calendar. You have the bells sounding. You have the smells and the incense. The body is empirically engaged in worship. But when it goes bad, it ends up in idolatry. So then you have the apophatic, which then closes our eyes when we pray. The cataphatic opens eyes, prays. Everything is a call to worship that I can see in a world made by God. The apophatic closes eyes because it doesn't want any distraction. It wants to focus on the one. And it's a wonderful way of worship also. Both are good, but both can be faulty. So the apophatic, you close your eyes and you become proud about how much you can shut out and how you can do this. And you saw it, when you were a kid and you're saying grace at the table, and after the prayer's over, before the meal, little Johnny says, Mommy, Bobby didn't have his eyes closed when we prayed. And you got the first Pharisee developed, the first legalist developed in that family. And so even Jesus talks about it. John came neither eating nor drinking. And you said he was a madman. The Son of Man came both eating and drinking, and you said he was a gluttonous person and a winebibber, a friend of sinners. He says, wisdom is vindicated by her children. And there is this blending, this balance. And the book, The Arthurian Torso, is full of this sort of thing. It's wonderful.
And you can see the influence of that on Lewis's thinking about iconoclasm, especially in Grief Observed. Now, tell us about the one of his books he gave to Joy Davidman, and he wrote a note in the front about idols that you have to avoid. And do you remember that? Tell us a little bit about that note.
I not only remember it, I know who owns that book. It's a good friend of mine, Steve Beebe.
Steve. Yes, we have.
Yeah.
He actually owns a book. So I have a photocopy of that cover. And it was a great divorce. And when Lewis was first meeting Joy, I think it was maybe their second meeting, she asked him to sign her copy. And he signs it, and he says, there are 3 images that we must always attend to and change. The image of God, the image of others, and the image of myself. So in essence, he's saying, I want God, not my image of God. I want my neighbor, not my idea of my neighbor. I want myself, not my idea of myself. And he says, from an unwritten book on iconoclasm, and I think the unwritten book was The Discarded Image, because in The Discarded Image, Lewis is saying every culture develops its sort of worldview. It brings something from the past. It's also shaped by new challenges of the present. And every culture would be wise to remember that just as the past had to become a discarded image, so its own day would become a discarded image. So we approach these things with some degree of humility and whatnot.
Right.
But this idea that you mentioned, iconoclasm, I think reality is iconoclastic is the biggest idea in all of Lewis's writings. And I think that's why he's such a good scholar too. He's not a guy who says, I've crossed every T and dotted every I. There's a hunger to him. There's a sense of wonder to him. You're quoting Chesterton a lot in this podcast, David. Chesterton ends his great little story, Tremendous Trifles, with these words: the world will never starve for want of wonders, but only for want of wonder. And Lewis was a person who I think was very much in quest of more of God, and therefore his heart was open. And I think we are the beneficiaries as he writes, because he awakens us to wonder of the world.
That is an excellent comment to close our conversation on.
I think so too. So we have Lewis helping us understand all these authors that he discusses throughout his many books. And we have Jerry helping us to understand C.S. Lewis. And hopefully this podcast will help everyone understand Jerry. So I think we've accomplished something here this morning.
No hope of that.
And I would also like to encourage you guys, if you haven't listened to the episode that we did on COVID-19 back in March, you would have thought that we would have dealt with that by now, but it seems like it's still a threat. And so if you guys are still struggling for guidance or an encouragement during this time, you can go back and listen to that episode. It's quickly become one of our best episodes.
Which is also with Jerry.
Yeah, which is with Jerry. It's actually in the top 5 now, but I think it's more relevant than ever, especially with a lot of the issues facing us as we look towards the fall. So.
Well, we consider Jerry to be a special guest, and that's why we broke out the lawn furniture for this session. So it just,
Well, I think actually the special gift to Wheaton College was Crystal and David Downing. And I don't know how they ever got you to come to Wheaton, but I am very, very grateful. And though I've known you for years, I feel like our friendship is really deepened since you've been here, and I'm really grateful.
It's part of the reason we came to Wheaton is we wanted to hang out with people like you two. It's a wonderful, stimulating, and edifying environment. So thanks again for joining us, Jerry.
Thank you.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.